First things that come to mind. Well, when I was born, my dad was already a pastor. He was pastor of the First Baptist Church in North Reading. But he came to the pastorate fairly later in life. He was he was born in South Weymouth in 1910, and he worked a little bit with his father, who was a painter and wallpaper guy. So he learned that trade, and one of my other uncles did too. And he pursued it all his life. But then my dad went in the insurance business in Boston. So, and I don't know what he did in the insurance business, but he worked in the insurance business in Boston, which is where he met my mom, because she was working also in the insurance business in Boston with Monarch Life Insurance. So I'm assuming that that's where they somehow connected. But anyway, by the time I was born, he had come to the Lord and had gone to Gordon College. His senior year at Gordon College, he became the senior pastor of First Baptist Church in North Reading. And then he went on to seminary, which was Gordon. But in those days, Gordon College was in the Fenway in Boston, and the seminary was in Brighton in Boston, in a separate, had their own building. And so he graduated from the seminary in 42, I think. 39 from the college, 42 from the, so, and I was born in 41. So he was still at seminary and pastoring that church when I was born. He was there until about 1943, maybe, only a year or so. And he decided that he really needed, the war was going on, so he decided that he really was called to be a chaplain in the military. So he went to chaplain school, which was at Harvard, interestingly enough. He became an Army lieutenant and became a chaplain, and he traveled around a lot. He was stationed in Nebraska. Don't remember the name of the town in Nebraska. And then he was stationed down in San Antonio, Texas, at a chapel down there. And he was also stationed in California. He was in a branch of the Army. It really was the Army Air Corps, which before there was an Air Force, all the military flying was done by the Army. It was called the Army Air Corps. So it had this kind of unique insignia that he wore with a propeller with wings on it, you know. So he was a part of that kind of a group. And then they deployed, and they went to the South Pacific. He ended up in Dutch West Guinea, and was there for a while. Caught dengue fever badly, and they wanted to discharge him and send him home, but he didn't. He wouldn't do it. And then he ended up in the Philippines. And while he was in the Philippines is when he got involved in the GI Gospel Hour movement. And then went in Japan right after the signing of the armistice in 1945. And started a lot of ministries there. And then from then on, you know, it became a mission board, and he went back as a missionary and so on. So that was his whole life. When I knew him, at least, he was a pastor or a missionary, and he remained in the Army as a chaplain the whole time in reserves. My mom, she was from Scotland, born in Renfrew, as you know. Been to the little apartment or whatever, the flat where she was born. She came here when she was 14 years old in 1928. She was born in 1914. So she was 14 years old when she came here with her mother and brother. Her dad had already come a year earlier and was working in Quincy. So she became a naturalized citizen because of her dad. Her dad was naturalized. And just lived there in Quincy, went to schools in Quincy, went to Quincy High School. Ended up working in the insurance business in Boston. It was the flapper era, which was interesting. And she really did a lot of flapper type, clothes and dressing and all that. It was really kind of strange. And her mother died not too long after they were here, within a couple of years, I think. And then my grandfather remarried Dorothy Guttrow, Catholic from Boston. So she's the only person that I ever knew sort of as a grandmother. We never called her that. We just called her Dot. And my grandfather, who was 5'2", he was just a little fire plug of a guy, but had a very thick Scotch accent. I couldn't understand him hardly at all. He spoke with a brogue. And then, of course, I lived with my mom all during the time when my dad was away in the military. And when he went overseas, we moved down to Quincy, actually in Wollaston, right down the road from Eastern Nazarene College in Wollaston. And I remember being there in that Wollaston house. I remember having my tonsils out when I was 4. It was the old days when they put a mask on your face that had like a gauze in it, and then they poured chloroform, into it. I remembered that stuff, what it smelled like. It was awful. I had the mumps while I was there. I went up through 2nd grade, I think, while I was there. And I remember VJ Day. I just remember all the church bells were ringing in the city, in the city of Quincy, and people were all out walking up and down the street, just congratulating each other or whatever. So I just remember walking up and down the street, and Victory in Japan Day. And then my dad came home quite a few months later. He came home about Christmas of 1946. And by the middle of the next year, we were headed to Japan. He became the field chairman of the Japan field of Far Eastern Gospel Crusade, and went to agreed to go to Japan. And so we drove out. I remember coming home from school, and there was a brand new Plymouth, 1947 Plymouth, sitting in our driveway. And turns out that they had bought that, and we used it to drive across the country. And I don't remember a whole lot about that trip, but I do remember somewhere in the middle of maybe like Kansas or something like that. It was wintertime, and the roads were icy, and there was a horrific accident up in front of us, pieces of cars flying everywhere, so on. People were killed lying in the road. And then I remember coming down out of the mountains into the state of Washington on a very, very, very slippery, snowy thing. And I remember coming down out of the mountains, and it was really treacherous driving, and all the cars were all kind of inching along and so on, and we stopped for something, and there was one car that had gone off the road and was kind of hanging over into midair, off the guardrail or something. And then a big tractor trailer truck came up behind us and couldn't stop, and so he's sliding down the mountain right up behind our car. And so it's funny, the little stuff these little vignettes that you remember. I don't remember anything else about the trip. I do remember when we got to we were in Seattle, and you had to get shots, because you were going overseas. So you had to have all the tetanus and typhoid and all that stuff. And so I don't know why we did it that way, but anyway, all three of us went and we got them all at the same day, all at the same time. And then we just all kind of lay around in a hotel room for about 3 days. Couldn't move, sore. But anyway, we shipped over to Japan, arrived in Japan in February of 1948. And we took that car with us. And I remember it being offloaded from the ship. I think a slide of it being, set off on the pier. And that car my dad used to trade with the owner of the Emperor's Dairy Farm in Japan and bought the farm for the price of that 47 Plymouth. When I first went there, we arrived in February of 1948, 2nd of February 1948, which of course was fairly soon after the war. The war only ended in August of 45. And there were a lot of Americans there. For the most part, they were military, because Japan was still under what was called military occupation. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the country in the military occupation. And so there was a lot of military still in Japan. And we moved into a beautiful old classic Japanese house in Tokyo that the GIs had bought sort of as a headquarters for this new mission board. So we were there, and there were no foreigners around that part. So, as a kid, whenever I would go out on the street, I would get an instant crowd. And I used to having a lot of people around, just seeing this blonde-haired American little kid, I would have been 6 when we got there. And the only schools that were available at that time were military schools. The military had a number of bases. The base in Yokosuka, for example, had been a Japanese Navy base, and that became one of our Navy bases. And in Tokyo, but we had Air Force bases around and Army bases around, and they had, dependent public schools and so on. So that's where I went initially. And I'm not sure how my dad got me into those, because we weren't in the military, but he was a very active reserve officer, stayed as a chaplain all his life. So somehow they got me into the military schools. So I went to the military schools through 3rd grade. And then the missionaries that were starting to arrive in Japan by then with families decided that they really needed a school, of their own. So they started a school. It was called the CSIJ, Christian School in Japan. It started in Tokyo, and I was there its very first day. It was in 1950 that they started it, and I was in the 4th grade. And it moved a couple times in those early years. They started on the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, OMF compound, and then they had been a Japanese kindergarten and building, and we used that. It was interesting. I remember one day while we were there, they opened up it wasn't a closet, it was some sort of a closed up area under the stairs or something like that, and they found all these wooden rifles. And apparently the children, during the war, the Japanese children were all drilled with these wooden rifles and all that kind of stuff, kind of militaristic, getting them used to the idea of being soldiers. Crazy. And then after that school moved to the property in Kurame that my dad had bought, from the Emperor's Dairy, and that became the campus for Christian Academy in Japan, which it still is today. And now it's a beautiful, huge campus with all these beautiful buildings and so on. So very early in my time in Japan, I didn't know any language. I didn't know any Japanese. Um, but you could travel safely around, and I did. I mean, I rode the trains to school and stuff like that. Um, the trains in those days, of course, Japanese are known for their trains, as are many other countries besides the United States. And they had special cars that they put on the trains, and it had a white stripe, big white stripe down the side of it. And the seats were all covered with white linen and everything else. And those were just for Americans, foreigners, military. And you never paid anything to ride in any of their public things if you were riding in the military thing, which is interesting. I mean, the car with the Japanese people in it would be, the train car is supposed to hold 200 people, and they had 700 in there, kind of hanging out the windows and everything else, jammed in. And then the car that I'd get into would be virtually empty. So I could, I'd be sitting there in the middle of this car, one little kid, this huge, and in these white linen seats. So it was really different. That was right after the war, so it was still they were still very conscious of, of that stuff. There were still a lot of evidences of the war around. Tokyo, huge sections of Tokyo had, of course, been bombed flat and burned. Same in Yokohama. So seeing whole sections just, devastated. And they were pretty industrious people. So, I mean, they didn't just leave stuff sitting there wrecked. They cleaned them off. So you'd come through Tokyo and you'd see huge areas that were just nothing but, but dirt, because they had cleaned off old buildings that got bombed. And during the war, there was a lot of things that they set up for defense of the homeland in case we ever invaded Japan. So they had a lot of caves and things that they dug into the hills, for self-defense. And a lot of those still had weapons in them, still had these major gun emplacements in there. They were still finding weapons and ammunition and everything else. Even when I got there in 1948, they were still finding stuff around the countryside. So I came back in 52, 53 on furlough, and we lived in South Weymouth, and I went to South Junior High School in Weymouth for that year. That was the year that we rode from California here on the California Zephyr train, and then we went back on the California Zephyr train to Oakland, California, and then we shipped out of there again. But when I came back finally in 1958, after I graduated from high school, I came back by myself on a Japanese passenger ship, the Kawamaru, which went to Hawaii first. And we had some missionary friends in Hawaii that I stayed with for a couple of days. So that was my first time in Hawaii. And then we came into Vancouver, actually, British Columbia. And the ship had a collision in the harbor while we were in Vancouver, which was my second ship collision. I'd had another collision at sea once, when I was younger. And landed in, and then it came down the inland waterway, and we ended up in Seattle. So I stayed with some friends in Seattle and then flew back. That was my first commercial flight. So I flew back to Boston, and I lived with Annie, Irene, and Unc in Quincy for a while, and did some work on a place down in Weymouth, on the homestead in Weymouth, sort of preparing a house for my folks when they came back. When I was in high school, I rode motorcycles. I had several bikes during that period, and but I never drove cars. I never got a car license, but I did learn to drive in a Jeep. We were. My dad was away. My dad was back in the States, I think, raising funds, and we were up at our summer compound. The mission had a summer compound up by Mount Fuji, at Lake Yamanaka, and we were up there, and something happened. One of the children that was there was injured or something. Anyway, my mom had to come back to the headquarters in Yokohama, and you know, like most kids, I had learned a little bit about driving. You know, my dad would put me in the Jeep, and I'd back it up and down the driveway kind of thing. You know, that was it. But I knew how to shift it and how to handle it and everything else. And we had to come back down, and it was quite a ride. It was like about a 4-hour drive back to Yokohama. And my mom and I in the Jeep, and this little boy who was sick. Mom had to take care of the little boy and hold him and all that. So I ended up having to drive. I had never driven in my life. So we got in the Jeep, and I drove it home for four hours back. You know? Yeah. So when I get to Rhode Island, my boss, Lloyd said, do you have a license? I said, well, yeah, I've got this, but it's a Japanese license, and it's only for motorcycles. And he said, they won't know the difference. So he took the license, and he went in town, and he came back, and he handed me a driver's license. So I never took a test. I never drove a car. I did anything. And I've been driving for 60 years or whatever. Never, yeah. So that Japanese motorcycle license stood me well. But, of course, on the farm, you had to drive all their vehicles, their trucks and all that stuff. And so it was a good year. I learned a lot about farms and cows and harvesting Johnny cake corn in the winter in the snow, and it was an interesting experience. It was good. It was really a good experience. Very early mornings, obviously, working and doing the chores, and he was a mechanic. He was like most farmers. He was very good at a lot of things. So we rebuilt a 1935 Ford Roadster that winter. We also rebuilt a couple tractors. I remember taking tractors all apart and pulling the engines apart and, lapping the cylinders and putting the pistons back in and all that stuff. So I learned a lot about that, and I bought my first car while I was there, an old Chevy convertible, and fixed it all up, got it all working, painted it and everything. And so that was an interesting, valuable time. My dad died early after 2 terms in Japan. They came home, and they were hoping to go back and open a new field in Okinawa. But that's when he was discovered to have cancer. He died a month after his 51st birthday. In fact, he died the day before my mother's birthday. I was a sophomore in college. When I went to Gordon, I went to Dickinson College first, my freshman year, and then transferred to Gordon. And just before I started at Gordon, they had discovered cancer in my dad, and they did surgery at the New England Baptist Hospital in Boston. And they discovered when I opened them up that the cancer had spread everywhere, and there was nothing they could do. So they took one lung out, which was the worst of it, and sewed him back up. So when I came up to Gordon, I basically came right directly from the hospital, having learned that my dad was full of cancer and was not going to live very long. And it's also a day that there was a small hurricane going on. So I drove up to Gordon campus my very first time during a hurricane, having come right from the hospital. And I was down, they were living in Brockton at the time, and he was interim pastoring in a Covenant church in Brockton. And so I was down to Brockton off and on a lot that winter. and then he died in the spring. So my mom, we cleared her out of the house there at Brockton, and moved up here to Hamilton, right over here on Mill Street, 52 Mill Street, was it? And she was there, and I lived at home, while going to Gordon, and then just about the time we graduated, and just before Marilyn and I left for Japan, she bought the house over here on Pine Street, and we moved her in there. And she lived in that house all the time that we were in Japan, in the Navy. And when we came back, she moved into an apartment because she didn't need the whole house. She moved into an apartment, and we stayed in the house. And then eventually she sold that house when we sold our house in Topsfield, and we bought this house together. And she moved into that apartment. And then she died in 1992, at the age of 77. She had congestive heart failure. I didn't know my family very much at all because I grew up overseas. The uncle and aunt that I knew best was my auntie Irene. And she and her husband, Unc, were both solid Christians, part of the church in Quincy, where my dad and mom were for a while. And in fact, they at one point even considered coming to Japan as missionaries. Just so my whole family really has become, Marilyn's family.
My parents. My father's name was Sanford Garrison, and my mother was Florence Hitchner Garrison. They both grew up in the rural area near Elmer, New Jersey. Both of them grew up on farms of one sort or another. Daddy grew up on the Garrison homestead on Burlington Road, and mother grew up in Freesburg and Daretown. My father was the 8th of 12 children. 3 younger sisters, 3 little girls died before the age of 2. His father's name was William Garrison, and his mother's name was Mabel Pedrick. Grandma Garrison died on March 1st, 1950. She had had several strokes, and as long as I knew her, she was not in good health. And her funeral in 1950 was the first funeral I had ever attended. And it was the first time I ever saw, and I think the only time I ever saw my father cry. He was only 38 at the time of her death. And his family growing up was active in the Olivet Methodist Church. My mother was the oldest of 5 children, born to my Hitchner grandparents, whom we called Dee Dee and Nana. They were longtime members of the Daretown Presbyterian Church, and that's where my parents were married. I remember Dee Dee having a lot of carrier pigeons in his upper garage barn, and he also apparently had a business early on of making potato chips because he had a machine for doing that. And he had a very meticulous garden. He had, what I most remember is asparagus and strawberries, just beautifully groomed strawberry plants. The farm on which my father grew up was both dairy, but I also remember a long row, just long stalls of horses, because everything then was done by horsepower, not tractors. My mother trained to be a teacher. She went to Glassboro Normal School, and I don't know that this was her first, I guess this was her first job. She taught at a little local school not very far from where my father grew up. And my father said he was going to go pick up Uncle Sidney because they had to walk to school. There was no no bus, no cars, etc. So he said he was going to go pick up Uncle Sidney, who was 11 years younger than he was, so he could also meet the new teacher. And that's how they met. But that was 11 years before they were married. Early on, there were a number of things that Daddy did. He was working with his father, but then he also went out west and lived on a distant relative's ranch in Montana, where he helped them. And then at some point, he also went to Taylor University for 2 years. And he really wanted to finish there, but apparently my mother gave him the ultimatum that, if there was something's going to happen, it was either her or school. And I remember my cousin Allison saying that apparently Daddy went to their house, Aunt Pauline, up in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, and was talking with Aunt Pauline because he was having a hard time making a decision about what to do. And Allison was a young girl, and she said she overheard the conversation. But apparently it was at that point that Daddy decided, I guess he had to be serious and leave school. And so, because they weren't young, by the time they were married, they were 29. He was 29, she was 31. Well, he told a number of things. One thing he did, he talked about, I don't know how he did this, but he talked about riding the rails. They'd hop onto a freight car or else ride on the top of a train. It didn't sound like it was something that, obviously not anything I would ever do. But he really valued his time out with this family. It was a Cook family, which was a distant relative of one side of the family. Okay. Growing up on the farm was a unique experience, something that's lost for most people today. Not when we were younger, but when we were older, especially after we reached high school age. Susan and I took turns milking the cows, one in the morning and one in the evening, and then we would rotate the next week and we got paid 25 cents a week to help with the milking. And Susan especially was mortified that she would go to school in the morning and smell like a cow. But growing up when we were younger, we had a fenced-in yard. It was not like a nice wooden picket fence. It was a wire fence so that we wouldn't get out into the yard where tractors and trucks and all the things that were going on a farm took place. We were safe in this fenced-in yard. And we had a swing. We had a seesaw that my grandfather built. We had a sand pile. We had an outhouse at the end of the chicken coop, the chicken house. So if we needed to go to the bathroom, we went into this 3-hole outhouse. My mother locked the screen door. This was in the summertime. My mother locked the screen door so that we wouldn't go in and out. And even at some point, if we were going in and out, she would be known many times to comment, "Look, it's either in or out, not in and out." So she had a pretty strict expectation of us to take care of ourselves. Because we didn't have a lot of things, we had to entertain ourselves, and we had to find ways to be creative. One thing about growing up on the farm, obviously, there was a lot of we have a big garden, and there was a lot of produce. So as we were older, we would help my mother with the canning or shelling beans or peas and helping with that. But my mother's aunt, Aunt Eva, who was my great aunt, was very instrumental in my life. She would come and spend days at a time at our house helping my mother. And I think a lot of it was because my mother just had trouble being a mother with young children. And she would come and she would help with the mending, she would help with the cleaning, she would help with the canning and the cooking, and she was just an all-around wonderful person. And I think she, other than my parents, Aunt Eva, I think, was one of the ones that is most instrumental in who I admire or model as a Christian woman who really prayed for and cared for us. She would also have us come and spend nights at her house. And I remember, usually it was Susan and me together. She would give us alcohol, back alcohol rubs. And then she would kneel beside the bed and pray for us. That just has remained with all four of us girls all of our lives. She was just a very loving woman and memorable. In her bedroom, she had this very large wardrobe, which is what I picture the wardrobe from the Chronicles of Narnia, in which she didn't have a closet. This wardrobe was her closet. And I kind of, often would look in it and imagine what it was like. My mother didn't think I was old enough or ready to start what was then called beginners. It's kindergarten. As a 5-year-old, so she delayed me starting, and I started as a 6-year-old. And I had a very grandmotherly kind of a teacher, and she was very caring, except there was one thing that really was very upsetting. I was helping a third cousin, Kenny Garrison, because he was kind of slow, and he didn't understand what he was supposed to be doing, so I turned and was telling him what to do. And because I was talking in class, she put me in the corner. And I can't tell you how devastating that was. I was humiliated. But Susan was just 15 months younger than I. So when I finished beginners, they didn't move me to first grade. They promoted me to second. Well, the next year, Susan started. They didn't put her in beginners. They didn't put her in first grade. They put her right into second. So we were both in second grade at the same time. She was in a different classroom, even though there generally were there was one class per grade. She was in a combination first, second grade. So the next year, I think the teachers felt that it wasn't a good idea for us to be in the same grade all the way through school. So they skipped me up to fourth grade. Never consulted my parents. I came home from school and I said, guess what? I'm in fourth grade. So that was obviously an adjustment. I did not have a lot of friends. Because we were out in the country on a farm, a lot of people in towns would have friends nearby and they'd walk to visit and so on. I didn't have a lot of friends. I had girls that I knew from Daretown Presbyterian, Sunday school, or Christian Endeavor. But I really didn't have friends. We just had sisterhood. Until I got to 8th grade, and my teacher, who was also the principal, felt that he said, you don't apply yourself, but you have potential. You just need to, apply yourself. So he selected me to be one of the 2 graduation speakers, which was a huge honor. You really want to know where we met and how we met? Well, Gordon College was where we met. And how we met, I'll let him tell.
Okay.
Your perspective.
I was the proud driver of a 1949 Plymouth in my sophomore year at Gordon. But that meant I had a car, which most guys did not. So the first night we were there, was it the first night? The first night we were there. They had, they have a kind of an orientation thing, and they had it at Singing Sands Beach in Manchester. And so they needed anyone who had cars to drive so that they could ferry people over there because they didn't have vans and buses and stuff. So I said, okay, I'll drive. So I pulled in the parking lot and a bunch of people piled in, and she was one of them. And drove over to Singing Sands and, had our evening, had the bonfires and supper and all that kind of stuff and everything else. And then right back. I didn't notice that, she was among the group. But anyway, that's it. So then later, when we first started in choir, we went to choir tryouts, and they had asked for, and she was there, and they had asked for volunteers to do a varsity quartet, a men's varsity quartet, basically as a gospel team to travel around for the college. And it was a great opportunity because they paid your tuition to do that. So anyway, we had tryouts, and 4 of us were selected to be that gospel team. And so we started practicing, and Sybil Coleman played piano for us while we were practicing, learning all our music. And then the first night that we were supposed to sing and actually do a service was at the First Baptist Church in Haverhill. And
November 20th.
We had to drive up there, and Sybil couldn't go, which was okay because we sang a cappella anyway. She was just helping us practice. So we went up, but Sybil said she couldn't go, and Marilyn said, well, I'll go.
And I didn't even know these guys.
Unbeknownst to me. So anyway, I got the car, and we got the 4 guys, and Marilyn came and climbed in with us and wanted to go hear us sing. Okay. So we drove up there and sang, and I drove back. And when we got back to campus, the guys could just go do their thing, but here was this girl sitting in the car, and I guess I ought to at least go over and get a cup of coffee or something. So we went to the snack shop and had whatever, and
probably hot chocolate.
That turned out to be our first encounter, our first date. And unbeknownst to me, she had all this in mind for a long time ahead of time. So
I had my eye on it, but it was very unlike me to push myself in being with these guys who I really didn't know. But the rest is history.
Yeah, I suspect they were aware of something going on.
Yeah. I think
anyway,
so.
I was
oblivious.
Well,
he sang in the varsity quartet, but then the next year, not that year, the next year, I sang in the varsity trio with some other women, and we did a lot of traveling and singing too. But I didn't get tuition paid. I started in 1959 and graduated in 63, and he didn't come until 1960 because he transferred in. But then we both graduated at the same time. And Gordon at that time was very small. It was about 300 people, and it was more like a family. It was more intimate than a lot of schools are today, because we basically knew everybody. We're different.
Our majors were different. I ended up actually I had 2 majors, Greek and biblical studies, and she was an education major, so
our paths didn't cross that way, but we crossed in choir.
Yeah.
And at
mealtime.
Mealtime.
Yeah.
And I thought when I asked him when his birthday was, I thought he was pulling my leg. So he had to prove it to me by showing me his license. We share a birthday.
Well, of course, I grew up around the military. My dad was a chaplain all his life. So I was familiar with the military. And it just, in those days, it just kind of was an accepted thing to do. When you finished college, a lot of guys went in the military. I mean, at our Gordon graduation, one of our classmates had his white uniform on. He was a Marine, and he took his commission and everything right on this platform at Gordon at graduation. So it was kind of normal, and things were heating up overseas, and there were guys getting in. But when I went to Dickinson, they had an ROTC program. So I joined ROTC, Army ROTC. And so I was in the Army for a year, and I kind of realized that I really didn't want to be in the Army. I didn't really enjoy the Army. So I would, end up being an infantryman up there, getting shot at all the time. So when I transferred to Gordon, I had to leave the Army ROTC, and there was a draft going on, and I thought, there's a very good chance that they're not going to be real happy about my having bailed out after a year, and the draft is going on, and all of a sudden, guess what? I'm going to get a call. So shortly after I came to Gordon, and that was in 1959. Was it 60? Yeah, after my freshman year. So shortly after coming to Gordon, I went down to Salem, and it was a Naval Reserve Center in Salem, submarine reserve group, an old fleet diesel fleet submarine, the SS-401, and so I went down and talked to them and so on, and I joined the Navy. They promised me, because I was in college and you take all these tests and stuff, that I would be able to get into the officers program. So I joined, but when I joined as, just as a sailor. So I came in as a seaman recruit, and they gave me a full sea bag. And in those days, they still were issuing the 13 button bell bottom trousers, with the big flap with the 13 buttons. And so I was issued all that stuff, and still have them. In fact, they also gave me those blue, like the Donald Duck hats, it said U.S. Navy around it in gold, And just about the time I went in the Navy, they stopped allowing people to wear those, because a lot of guys were getting killed, hitchhiking at night and so on, and they were all dark, almost all black, and couldn't be seen. So they changed the rules. You had to wear your white hats, your Dixie Cup white hats. So I've got these things that are probably antiques now, sitting up there. So I went in the Navy in Salem, and after my sophomore year, the end of my sophomore year, I had been accepted into the Reserve Officer Training Program. And their school for that was at Newport, Rhode Island. So my whole summer after my sophomore year, I was in Newport, Rhode Island in the Reserve Officer Candidate School. Meanwhile, I was in the submarine division up here. And my junior year, I got deferred, not having to go down to Newport. They deferred me because I was able to work and help raise money for college. So I didn't have to go back to Reserve Officer Candidate School until after I graduated. So after I graduated in '63, I turned around, went right back down to OCS again, and that was an interesting experience. There were a lot of guys coming into the reserve program in the Navy to avoid getting drafted. So there were guys there from Harvard and MIT and all this kind of stuff. And the military stuff was pretty heavy and thick, PT and all this, all drilling and marching and all that. But that sort of petered out fairly quickly, because when you go into officers candidate school, there's a lot of things you have to learn. So it became pretty academic, pretty heavily, celestial navigation and all this kind of stuff. And it was interesting. A lot of those guys from Harvard had some trouble with this stuff. But I ended up being the section section leader of my section, and for whatever reason, I ended up with the highest grade in the class. So they gave me my choice of duty station. Say, okay, where do you want to go? Your first active duty assignment. And I said, well, I'd like to go back to Japan. I got this girl that I'm engaged to, and I'd like to have a chance to show her around Japan. And we got married a week. I graduated on the 30th of August of '63 from OCS. Got my commission as an ensign, and we were married the next weekend on the 7th of September down in New Jersey. And from there, I had a couple of schools, school in Philadelphia for a while, so we lived at the farm. Then I had a school in San Diego. While we were in San Diego, that Kennedy was shot. That was a wild experience, Yeah, because they didn't know what was happening. I mean, they didn't know if there was some conspiracy going on around the country or anything else. And I remember a chief petty officer came into class and interrupted the class and instructed us that the president had just been shot, and that the base was locked down and that we weren't going anywhere. I didn't get home till fairly late that evening, as I recall, when they finally, he died, and they finally came to the realization that it was an isolated thing. So I went there as a diesel engineering officer school, and from there we got a chance to ride a Navy, what was called it was like a passenger ship, but it was a Navy passenger ship. And so we left from San Diego, went to Hawaii, and then went to Japan and got back to Japan on the 2nd of February of 1964, right? So it was exactly to the day, 12 years or something since the first time I got to Japan as a kid. And went aboard ship in Yokosuka. The ship was in dry dock. It was getting an overhaul. I went aboard as the engineer. The chief engineer was on leave somewhere else, so I ended up being the engineering officer immediately. Walked into the ship. And you've been to all the school and you think you know something, and you get there and immediately you realize you don't know anything at all. This is, So I took the ship through the rest of the shipyard experience. Because I spoke Japanese growing up, they were thrilled because it's a Japanese, all the workers in the shipyard were all Japanese, even though it was a U.S. Navy base. And so I was able to get a lot of things accomplished, because I could talk to the guys in the shop. And so we got the ship back afloat and got it all tested out, and you do all this training and all that kind of stuff. And it's while we were training in Okinawa that we had this little problem in the Gulf of Tonkin. And next thing I know, I was on my way to Vietnam.
Culturally, obviously, it was a totally different culture. But I think I adapted fairly quickly. Of course, I was young, and so therefore I adapted a little bit more easily than I would today. I learned enough to get around. I took trains everywhere, streetcars. When we first arrived, we didn't have housing. So we were planning to live at the Crusade Center, the Far Eastern Gospel Crusade Center, where Papa had lived when he was younger. But we got housing. They said it would take 14 months to get housing, but we had housing within a month. So we found a house out in Hayama, and God was gracious because we moved in mid-February, and shortly after that, I think we were only there 3 weeks, shortly after that, we were told that we were given military housing. We moved to our housing, and just a few days later, I had this ruptured ovarian cyst, during which I passed out. I came to on the train to find some women, Japanese women, helping me off the train because I was traveling by myself. I had enough Japanese yen to get a streetcar to take me home, or to get a cab to take me home. And I didn't know what to do. We didn't have cell phones and things back then. So I went and I was lying down, and a neighbor came to introduce herself because we had just moved into housing. So I visited with her for a short time, and I told her I wasn't feeling well. So I stood up to help to let her out, and I passed out on her. So she called an ambulance, and it took me down to the Navy dispensary in Yokohama. And they examined me, and they thought I had an ectopic pregnancy, which is in the fallopian tube. At that point, I didn't know I was pregnant. And so then they put me in an ambulance to take me down to the Yokosuka Hospital, which is where Papa was stationed. And I had an emergency surgery because I had a ruptured ovarian cyst. And then I later found out that I was a month pregnant. And that baby is now almost 52 years old. But I was just grateful that it didn't happen while I was in this Japanese housing, because I had no phone, I had no way to communicate with anybody, and it happened the way it did. So gratefully, the longest he was gone at one time was 5 months. He left, and he mentioned earlier about the Gulf of Tonkin, and that's when the U.S. got involved in the Vietnam conflict. So he was gone, came back the 12th of October, and he had this impacted wisdom tooth, so he had to go and have it taken out. And he had lost a lot of weight, and he was not real strong because of having been gone at sea for so long. So he stood up one morning and he passed out in the bathroom. So he was home recuperating for a while. And that was in October. Then Andy was born in November. He got temporary active duty to stay there so that he would be home when Andy was born. And he was there until January, when he left early January and was gone. They were gone, and they were going to be in dry dock in Sasebo. And if I wanted to see him again without a long time in between, I would need to go take a train and go visit down there. And it was a 22-hour train ride. So I did that, left my 8-week-old baby with a friend, and took this train down to Sasebo, spent a couple days there just so I could see him before he was going to be gone again for months. So it was months at a time that he was gone. He would come in and out periodically, but as he mentioned, it was just like 3 weeks total that he had seen after he left from the first 2 months that he had seen his son, which was hard, so that when he came back, Andy just didn't know how to respond to this guy, that would come up and put his arms around me, and he would push him away. He didn't know what to do with this guy.
So we were in and out of Vietnam then for the whole rest of the 3 years that I was there. We made every amphibious assault in that 3-year period from 64, 5, and 6. And so I was gone most of the time. And it was a very, very, very active time. An LST is a landing ship. So you make amphibious assaults, obviously, like they did in D-Day, in combat situations. But you also sort of end up carrying a lot of stuff, this big tank deck. So, I mean, we took the whole Fighting Tiger Battalion of South Korean Marines from South Korea down to Vietnam. We carried a lot of civilian earth-moving equipment because they were using it there to build airstrips and stuff like that. So we carried a lot of ammunition. I mean, we made one amphibious assault, combat assault, and they loaded 1,000 short tons of M105 howitzer shells in our tank deck. Not what we were designed to carry, but that's what they gave us. And they said, well, you're a time bomb anyway. So they put, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of 50-gallon barrels of aviation gasoline all on our main deck and tied it on. And then they made us steam a half a mile away from all the rest of the ships going in. And when they all made the amphibious assault, we landed about a half a mile further up in the coast. And I mean, one mortar and it was just been a big hole in the sand there, And our skipper was really anxious to get this stuff off and get back to sea, because we were a sitting duck. When you're sitting there on the beach, you can't do anything, We were very heavily armed. We had a lot of guns, but so we had Marines aboard. So what we did was we had all our boats ready, all our landing craft ready, and as soon as we were coming in, we lowered them away, so they were all circling around in the water. When we hit the beach, those boats came alongside, and they faced aft, so that the propellers were facing into the beach, and they lashed them down, and then they ran their engines. So we had a huge wash of water going up the side of the ship toward the beach from these propellers of these boats. And then they took all that gasoline, and they just rolled them over the side. And in about an hour, they had the whole ship cleared of stuff. And the Marines went ashore, and they all stripped down to their skivvies, and they were all in the water getting these barrels and rolling them up on the beach and setting them up and all that. So it was an interesting exercise. Unfortunately, it took us 2 days to get the ammunition off, and some of it collapsed and killed one of our sailors. That was not a good time. But it was just hard work. The war was for us. We never were in a fight. They didn't have a navy, South Vietnam, or Vietnam. So we weren't really opposed. There were some mortar shells that came in that just missed us. But beyond that, we were not really in any kind of fight. It just was very, very, very hard work, hot. I was down to like 120 pounds, something like that, just from the heat, and it was just a very, 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 very busy time. We took a lot of Marines in. Unfortunately, we took some of them out who were not alive. It just was a very serious business. But like a lot of the military, there's a certain percentage of people who are right in the terror of combat, and then there's a huge group who are not, who are behind, in supporting roles, and so we were really more in that category.
You wondered also how I handled the language. Yeah. I never learned to read it, obviously, but I did learn enough to get around, and it was easier to get around then than it is today, because it wasn't quite as, it was a big, busy place, but not like it is today. And people were very forgiving and would try to tolerate my attempts at speaking. I did have a maid, believe it or not. Back then, if I wanted, I didn't have, when we first went, we didn't have our car, but later on we had Grandma Sweet and Unc take our car down to New York, and they shipped it across, so we had transportation. But we did everything by streetcar or shuttle, military shuttle trains. As you know, I am a letter writer, and I wrote to my parents once a week, if not more frequently, and to Grandma Sweet once a week, if not more frequently. The only time we made a phone call was when I had that emergency surgery. He made a call to my parents, maybe to Grandma Sweet too, just to say that I'd had this emergency surgery and it was okay. But it was very short because to make a phone call back then was 12 cents a minute. I mean, $12 a minute. We didn't have, obviously, the means that we have today. And the only other time that he made a call was when baby Andy was born to announce his birth. So communication was by letters. Nobody ever tried to call us, except for Sybil. Sybil called once before, or maybe it was after Andy was born. But that was all. And because we were away and because we didn't have the frequency like today for flying, I wasn't able to attend a sister's wedding in December of 1964. I had been asked to be in Sybil's wedding. I wasn't able to be there for that. So there were things that we just couldn't do. We did have visit from a couple that had gotten married just a few weeks before us and came back to work at CAJ, the mission school. So I remember Jean and Marion. I remember Jean putting Andy on his shoulders and as we were walking around the city. And but other than that, we didn't have visits. We didn't have visits from family like some people today would do. It was a very different time.
Yeah.
But yet it was a great experience. It was a wonderful experience for me, especially being with other missionaries. Another benefit was all the seamstresses that they had there. Even though I did love sewing, I had a lot of clothes made while I was there, and I would take the train way out into the country to a seamstress, and she would make clothes for me. And Dave, when he was in Hong Kong a number of times, he would have a tailor make suits for him, or he had a coat made for me. He had shoes made for me just by using a trace of my foot. They could just tracing the outline of my foot. They could make these very well-fitted shoes, which I can no longer wear because my feet have grown. I had a maid because I also did some part-time English teaching in a girls' school. So while I went there, I had to have someone stay with baby Andy. But then she would also come and clean for me. But I didn't like to have someone come to a dirty house, so I would clean my house before she came to clean my house. And it was just nice that I could just go out and get groceries without taking a baby with me. But it cost 1,000 yen a day for her to come for the whole day, and that was $2.78.
Wow.
So
did you ever get to talk with her? Did she not speak English?
she spoke English, broken English, and yeah, we talked, and she also did some sewing for me. But at one point when we were getting ready to leave, I had been chronicling things in a diary, and I had a lot of Andy's statistics of, as he was growing, and my diary disappeared. And I have a feeling she may have taken it. Maybe she thought there was some, government secrets that she could get from it. I don't know, but I was always sad that disappeared.
It was gone. So I'm guessing that means you didn't ever stay in contact with her.
No, but I did stay. Oh, another thing that I did was, there's so many different things I could share. I did have several Japanese girls who contacted me. I'm not sure how the contact was made, but just wanted to converse with somebody who spoke English because they wanted to develop their English. And Sachiko was one of them, and she invited me to her home, and it was interesting because she had a lot of the she was not from a Christian home. Another girl was, but they had their displays for Girls' Day and things for Boys' Day, and then they had their little worship things in the house and so on. But she would serve tea, but if you didn't slurp your tea, it showed you didn't appreciate it, or there were certain things that you had to. But so after for many years I did communicate with her, but then I lost touch. I had forgotten about that.
So, but you worked with them on English.
Right. Just to be able to converse with them so they could speak it and so they could hear a native speaker speaking in English. So that developed some nice connections too.
Yeah, what was getting household goods like? Like even grocery shopping, if everything's in a different language.
Oh, well, we had the benefit of a military commissary. And whatever the other thing was called. No, but I did go into some Japanese shops too. That was fun to go and buy things because everything was so inexpensive then. There was also a Christian bookstore in amongst some of these shops, and I enjoyed going there because it was run by missionary families, But going into some of the big department stores in both Tokyo and in Yokohama, very classy ones. It was very nice. I bought some nice British wool, things like that. Another thing that was very interesting was one time I went and I had this reddish-haired baby in my arms, and the sales girls were just gaga over that baby. And they took their hands and reached out to him, and he went right to them and disappeared from my sight. Today I would never do that. But they went to show them to all the other sales girls, and different. It was a different era. Yeah, he attracted a lot of attention because when he was born, he had reddish hair and blue eyes, and he was quite the attraction.
So I was on for 3 years. I saw Andy. Andy was born in ~64. And I was able to be there. I got a little bit of leave. I was able to be in Yokosuka for when Andy was born. But by the time we left, by the time I got off the ship in August of 1966, I had seen Andy a total of.
Other than the first.
Yeah.
A total of about 3 weeks.
That's all I had seen him, in the first 2.5 years of his life. And when I got back, when I got off the ship, and I came back on a ship, didn't I? I think I came back on a ship, on a destroyer or something. I didn't fly back to Japan. I came back on a destroyer or something, and got to Yokosuka, and Marilyn was in the hospital.
I also had a second emergency surgery just before we left. I made a lot of good friends, and a lot of them were through the church. But Glenda Parker was a good friend that was just a few houses up. We were in military housing, and a strong Christian. And she had a son, Andy's age, and then she had another baby. And when that baby was only 2 weeks old, she took Andy for the night because I had to go have emergency appendectomy, and had nowhere to leave him. So we've kept in touch. They live in Southern California, and that's been a good friendship. But that was just 2 weeks before we left to come back. The doctor, Papa was also at sea then, so when he came home, usually I was there to greet the ship, and I was not there. It was during that time I wanted to join this church, but in order to join a Baptist church, I had to be baptized as by immersion. And I really struggled with that for a while because I had been baptized as a believer, but I was 13 years old and it was by sprinkling. So I really prayed about it. I really struggled with the Lord about it, and I finally just gave in. And what a relief to just finally acquiesce and give in. And I was baptized in November of 1965 and became a member of the Yokohama International Baptist Church. It was a great church. For a while, I got involved in the chapel, the military chapel in Yokohama, and I went there and I taught Sunday school. I did VBS, but then later on, I got involved in the Baptist church. But I also spent a lot of time with missionary families, and I taught VBS for them when they had their conferences. So I taught their children. I played my marimba for different mission meetings that they would have. One time, I remember, I don't know how it got there. Somebody must have transported it for me, but I went quite a few hours north up by train, and someone had taken my marimba, and I played for a conference there. In the summer, 2 summers, I went to the summer places in Yamanaka with a single missionary woman who invited me to share her cottage with her. And that was a very restful time. It was cooler because it was in the mountains, because in the summer in the city in Yokohama, it was blistering hot. I would take 4 and 5 cold showers a day just to get cool.
USS Westchester County, LST 1167. World War II, era LST. 384 feet long, 64 feet wide, 5,500 tons. But I was the chief engineer, and had three different commanding officers during the 3 years that I was there. Patton was on when I came, but he was relieved shortly thereafter by Joseph Metcalf, who was a career naval officer, professional naval officer from Massachusetts, actually, and a real go-getter. I mean, just a real vim and vigor, Naval Academy, blue water sailor. And we all knew that he was going to go far, and he did. He ended up being the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations. He ended up being the admiral in charge of the entire surface navy of the United States, which was interesting. I met him in that capacity many, many, many years later. He came into Boston. His flagship, as the head of the surface navy, his flagship was the USS Constitution. That's just kind of the protocol. It's the way it is. So that was considered his flagship. And it's still the oldest active commissioned ship in the Navy. Constitution is. Well, they had a brand new ship that had been built. I think it was built up in Maine. And it was the USS Bunker Hill, a cruiser, guided missile cruiser. And they were going to commission it in Boston. So he decided that he was going to come up. They would commission the new ship. He would take the oldest ship in the Navy and get it underway, and we would do what they call passing honors in Boston Harbor as the new ship got underway and the oldest ship in the Navy was there, and you'd have a special duty with flags and all this kind of stuff. He was great for PR, and he's a real showman. And he was coming into Boston, and I was attached to the only naval facility in Boston. We were the only Navy people in Boston at that point. And so they contacted us and asked if we could arrange a driver to meet the admiral and his wife at the airport at Logan. So that I was executive officer, so I I got one of our sailors, and I arranged with him somebody who could be there during the day in the week. So I said, when you pick up the admiral and his wife, give them greetings from Captain Sweet, because it was Joe Metcalf, So they come in and they landed, and he pulled her in the car, and they got in the back seat and everything else. And as he's pulling away, he turned around and he said, "By the way, just bring you greetings from Captain Sweet." Well, his wife's name was Ruth. She said, "You got to join us." And the admiral said, "Oh, okay." So he says, "Meet me at the gangplank at noon," or whatever it was. So I had to get all in my whites the next day, and we went in. And here's the USS Constitution, loaded with all these dignitaries and all these people that are getting it underway. And the admiral, of course, would be the last one aboard. That's protocol. So he's down there, and I pull up. And so we got bombed aboard with the cross swords and the whole 9 yards. And we went up on the railing, and we did the passing honors to the ship. And I retired shortly after that, and so did he. That was my Navy career. It ended up being 26 years. I ended up as a captain. I had 3 years as a captain, so that became a permanent appointment. So I retired as a captain.
Well, we sailed and arrived in February 1964. And so for a while, we were there together, and we did things with missionaries at the Crusade Center. Well, when we first went, we didn't have housing, and we lived at the Crusade Center for a little while, very short time, but then we got local housing, but then we also, shortly after that, got base housing. So, and we got involved at the International Baptist Church right there in Yokohama, and until he went off and was gone for 5 months.
Yeah, the ship was in what they call overhaul, which meant it was right there, all torn apart. It had huge holes in it. They were taking engines in and out and all kinds of stuff like that. And as the chief engineer that I ended up being immediately when I got aboard, I was responsible for a lot of that. So, yeah, so it was a day job. I was down there aboard the ship. Sometimes I had overnights, and Yokohama was about
as far as we are here to Boston.
25 or 30 miles from Yokosuka. So I could get home in the evening. And
usually took a military bus.
The bus, or there was at least one guy who had a car. So yeah, so we were together there for a while. We went into Tokyo, did some traveling around. I was wanting to show her different things around the area. We couldn't take off and go way far away, but so we did local stuff. We went up to Tokyo and spent the day. And
like weekends you would be able to.
Well,
Saturday.
When you're in the Navy, the weekend is.
Sometimes he had duty on weekends.
You work 7 days a week on board ship, so yeah. And sometimes, every once in a while, you have duty, which means you have to stay aboard overnight, and you're in charge of something. So, but yeah, we had some time to travel around, and see some things, Japanese gardens, and went to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and ate in a favorite restaurant that my parents had taken me to when I was a kid in Tokyo, Russian restaurant that was really good.
Called Peter's. Brother.
It was unique that we were living right in the city of Yokohama, which is where the Crusade Center had been built years before, where I grew up. So we knew a lot of people over there, so we were up there a fair amount visiting people. That was the place where we did get invited out to a village or to a town, to a couple of single missionary women, for dinner, for supper. So we went, and by then we had brought our car over, which was a 1958 Mercury something or other. Anyway, it was huge. It was a boat. And we find our way out to this house, and the Japanese roads are very, very narrow. And they have gutters on both sides. Like deep, like 18 inches deep, bang, bang. you know, so
And walls.
you got to be real careful. And then the houses, the old Japanese houses had, you know, like stone walls, high, 6, 8 feet tall. And telephone poles would be outside those. So the roads were really tight. So driving that Mercury around was quite an experience. And after that supper, we left, and it was kind of a one-way route through that community. So we had to go out a particular way, and it's night, dark time, and so I'm driving along, and it's getting really tight. And at some point, I just sensed this car isn't going to make it, and I just stopped, and the car was touching the wall. The bumper was touching the wall on both sides.
Wow.
That was it, you know. And there was a guy behind me with his lights on. So, and I couldn't open the door to even go back and talk to him. So I just had to put it in reverse and start backing up. He saw what was happening, so he very graciously backed up a little further so his lights wouldn't be in my face. But he stayed there with me, and I had to back up probably, I don't know, half a mile or something through these telephone poles and everything else to get out of there and find another way to. Anyway, so no, we didn't go out. We didn't go out to people's houses a lot.
I did have an occasion. Well, I did a lot of train traveling and things by myself because he was gone so much. But I did have a professor from Gordon and his wife who were flying through from Korea one night, the Schaffels, and they had a layover at Haneda Airport. So it was a very rainy night, and I had baby Andy. But we went in by train to the airport and had dinner with him, and then I took the train back. So that was somebody that we saw, but they weren't living there, but at least I got to see. And then another time I took a long trip out to wherever Jean and Lois Taylor lived. And it was a long train trip, but I went out there for a weekend, again with baby Andy. He was 18 months old then. So I did a lot of getting around by myself.
She came down. I was in and out a lot by that time. By the time the Vietnam War started and we were really involved with the ship, I was away most of the time. But a lot of it was back and forth, carrying stuff. We went to Korea, for example, and took the Korean fighting Tiger Battalion of Marines, South Korean Marines, into Vietnam. And but we would come back to Japan periodically. And once I came in to Japan down south, way down south.
Mentioned it last time.
And
Sasebo.
so she decided to come down. So she got somebody to take care of Andy and rode on the train. It was a 22-hour train trip.
Sitting up.
Down there. It was down by Hiroshima and Nagasaki where the atomic bomb fell. We were through those towns. So she came down for a couple of days while we were there. We stayed in a Japanese hotel in town. That was neat. We have a number of pictures from that. Although we took all these pictures at Hiroshima. We went to Hiroshima, took all these pictures, and this is something you don't experience in your cameras today, but put a film in, took all these pictures. It didn't seem to be, getting to the end of the film. The film never got caught in the camera, so it never advanced, so we got no pictures at all.
Lost them all. Flew from Yokota Air Base to San Francisco area. Yeah. Whatever the base was there.
There's an Air Force base north of San Francisco.
And then that's where he got out of the Navy. By the time I got to sleep that night, I'd been awake for 32 hours because of getting out. And
long flight.
Andy sleeping and I didn't sleep, and oh my goodness, that was a long day. But then after he got out, then we started driving cross country.
Yeah, we picked up our car. We had shipped it back, and we had all our camping stuff in the trunk. We bought all the camping stuff in Japan at the exchange because it's cheap. And so everything was packed in the trunk, ready to go. So we picked up the car at the piers in San Francisco,
Went to a car wash, and our newly painted car that we had just had painted there, it
Turned
kind of
all white.
took off a lot of the paint.
Well, it got
Dirt.
salty, from shipping across the ocean, and so when it came out of the car wash, the car was half white, and the guy at the car wash was
blue.
petrified. He said,
Blue.
"Oh man, I destroyed this car. I had to paint the whole thing." So we took off that day, and we drove. Our first stop was in Lake Tahoe,
Beautiful, clear
California.
water.
It was our first camping experience. We had a little 9 by 9 foot canvas tent, and had a pole in the middle. So we stepped on either side, and Andy had to kind of
A half a
have a
because it
floor
was small.
to sleep in, and we camped all the way across the U.S. that way.
Visited some friends in Grand Junction, Colorado, and then we tried to find Mark and Sybil in Minnesota. Then we visited friends in Michigan and went to the Crusade Center
And then,
in Michigan, and
Still going?
then came.
yeah, it's okay.
Then we came to the farm where they saw their first grandchild.
Yeah, we had some interesting experiences on the trip. We drove across country, so and camping, and it was neat. But the very first in Utah, so the second day, I got a flat tire. Those things happened in those days. You don't see them in those. But
Now they blow out.
so I had to jack up the car, but in order to do that, you really wanted to block the wheels, and I didn't have anything with me, no rock. This is out in the desert, So I took the brand new Coleman stove that we had, and I put it in front of the wheel because it was about 6 inches high, and it worked well. Problem is, I forgot to take it out after we're done. So we got back in the car and started up, boom, drove right over it. So we bought another camping stove then. And then when we got back to New
But
Jersey,
before that, in the middle of the desert again, you had this horrific toothache.
oh yeah, on a Saturday,
And
drove into
gratefully,
someplace,
we found in this small town there was a dentist that was open.
in Utah, and he took my tooth out for me, and I drove the rest of the way with Novocaine. Yeah. When we got to New Jersey, the next day, we drove into town in Elmer, and it was a Pontiac dealer there, and they had a used Pontiac Le Mans 64 that was really clean and beautiful. So we dumped the Mercury and drove home in a Pontiac.
Well, definitely involvement in the life of a church is a must for anybody who's a follower of Christ. But I would say make sure you pray together, read together, talk together, sing together. I wish we had done more singing together as a family. We did some, but not like I wish we had. Play games, walk. We used to do a lot of walking, and especially when Andy and Jan were little, walked a lot in the woods. We did some with Nathan and Amy, but I think it waned a little bit later on. But also, when you have children, make sure that helping them pursue a faith in Christ, that's more important than sports and other things. And also keep close connection with your children's friends, so you know who they are and what they're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the temptations. So you're involved in church and you're a Christian family, and you do things. You have devotions together. You do reading together. You go to things together, and so on. But one of the temptations in all of that is for it to just sort of become fairly routine. And almost sort of taken for granted. And that's a dangerous thing, I think. The older I get, the more I realize that, and in our case, I mean, we're right here in a community next to a major evangelical seminary. And, we've been in a church that's full of highly theologically educated people and so on. So we've had Sunday school, we've had teaching, we've had excellent preaching all through the years. And even starting at Gordon, biblical studies was finally my major in Koine Greek. And then gone on to seminary, and I never finished at the seminary, but taking seminary courses and so on. It's easy for you to really build up your knowledge of spiritual things. And there's a passage in the Old Testament that warns Israel about being at ease in Zion, or sitting idly under the scriptures, not taking it beyond simply learning it and understanding it, but applying it and really making it a part of your heart. That's a real strong inclination and temptation that happens. In olden days, historically, that has led to what I guess Christian historians would call dead orthodoxy. The fact that all of your theology is right and you understand everything about the scriptures down to the minutia, which is, of course, what the Pharisees did. And all that becomes really your spiritual life rather than really a personal relationship with Christ. And service is the same way. You can be tremendously involved in the church and doing service of all kinds. And I think the Lord calls us to be involved, and obviously to be involved in ministry. And eventually we got a lot more involved in missions, and then we started getting involved in short-term missions and going to the short-term mission field. And we're not the kind of personalities that are good with evangelism and meeting people we don't know and that kind of thing. It's just not kind of the gifts we have. But even being involved in missions, we really had a heart for that, and it's more like being mobilizers, helping other people who are really called to the mission field and getting behind them and supporting them and encouraging them. So all that's good stuff, but it can all fill your whole life up, and it's not a relationship with Jesus, personally. And the older I get, the more I realize that danger. And I guess it wouldn't be dead orthodoxy so much maybe as complacent orthodoxy. And that's a dangerous thing.
Or just being comfortable.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm discovering, and of course I retired 12 years ago now from Gordon, but then I worked really for 10 years there pretty intensively and doing all that video stuff, and traipsing all over the world and back and forth to India 8 or 9 times and so on and so forth. So it was really, really active. But now that we're both fully retired, Marilyn's still heavily involved in working at the church, but I've really stopped doing all the stuff I was doing. And you begin to find out that how much of your life was all taken up with all the stuff you were doing, and begin to realize that no, your identity and your well-being spiritually all depend on the Lord Himself being your primary source of identity, your primary source of joy, your primary source of satisfaction. All that's important. And if you let it get filled up with activity and knowledge and everything else and don't develop a real heart thing, then all of a sudden when all it stops, it's kind of, where'd everything go? We keep busy. We have things to do. We're not sitting around. Although I'm not doing very much these days. Waiting for the weather to get warmer so we can get back outside, keep working in the yard. But it's really, really important. It's all about your relationship with Jesus and knowing him. And in the end, he's not going to ask you about all the stuff you did. He's going to ask you about whether you knew him or not. So that's really, really key. And we keep emphasizing church for our kids and so on and so forth, and we think all that's important, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what you think about Jesus and whether you know him personally or not. That's what it's all about. And it's easy to substitute. So